Hey, good morning and welcome to The Gathering. I'm so glad you've joined us for part 2 of our series called Atypical. It's all about family. And really we're looking at family dysfunction and how God can still use that. This week we asked some questions on Instagram. Our Instagram is at FSM Kent, and throughout this series we've been asking questions to learn a little bit more about your family. This week we asked about parents and how many parents people had, including step parents. And most of you said 2, but there were some 3s and 4s for families that have parents that are remarried. We also asked how many people you live with, like how many siblings do you have? We had 2 and 3 most common, 1 family all the way up to 5 siblings, a couple of 4s. We've got a few big families here at FSM. And then we asked a real honest question. When was the last time you got in a disagreement with your parents? Now, the answers were almost unanimously this morning or today. And so there were a few people that were like, oh, as far back as last night. But for the most part, there's some arguments and disagreements with parents pretty regularly when you're a middle schooler or a high schooler. I know of a guy named Patrick. He's actually a business expert and pretty famous, speaks around the world. But he tells a story of him and his wife. And the dream happened. His sister-in-law married his best friend. Your best friend became family. How cool is that? And that's what they thought for the first few years. After a couple of years, his sister-in-law and best friend had the worst thing happen. They got a divorce. And Patrick asked the question, what happened? You always looked so happy. There was not even a disagreement among you. And that's what his friend said. He goes, yeah, actually, we thought that too. We thought you guys were going to get divorced because you were always bickering about something. And he goes, but that's when we realized we weren't telling each other that we were having disagreements or conflict. We were just keeping it in. And then one day it wasn't enough to keep it in anymore. And we blew up and we couldn't overcome it. And that's when Patrick said, that's when he realized that conflict inside of families is okay as long as you engage it. And I would add this, and this is what we're going to talk about today. Conflict is okay, especially if you're willing to pray about it. So last week we talked about the very first family in history, Adam and Eve. And this week we want to take you a few generations later to a guy named Abram. And if you've been in the church for a little while, you probably know his name changes to Abraham. You probably heard the story of him and his wife Sarah not being able to have kids and then having Isaac late in life and that whole thing about maybe sacrificing Isaac. It's a pretty crazy story that you could read for yourself this week later on in Genesis. But what I want to do is I want to stay in Abram's story where he's traveling with his nephew Lot. And see, this story we don't talk about a lot. It's pretty cool though because it really shows, hey, a different family perspective, and even how God might work in that family. As they traveled, they actually both gained a lot of wealth and great people that worked for them and large flocks that they traveled with. And what's interesting is they started to run into some conflict with each other. Even though they worked closely in business, they lived and traveled together. And here's what we read about them in Genesis chapter 13, verse 5. It says, Lot was traveling with Abram, had also become very wealthy with flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle, and many tents. But the land could not support both Abram and Lot with all their flocks and herds living so close together. So disputes broke out between the herdsmen of Abram and Lot. At the time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land. Verse 8, finally, Abram said to Lot, let's not allow this conflict to come between us or our herdsmen. After all, we are close relatives. And so here's the thing. The story starts in a really great spot. As they begin to have conflict, Abram addresses it. And then goes, hey, here's the deal. Why don't we just go our separate ways but stay close? And that's what they do. In fact, they live in separate cities, but their family is still family. So before we continue with Abram and Lot's story, again, I want to remind you or inform you if you didn't know, but Abram and Sarah are old, like your grandparents old, probably actually older than your grandparents. And the difference is they're not grandparents and they're not even parents. And see, what happens in between chapter 13 and the verses we're going to read in a moment in chapter 18 is God shows up and tells Abram and Sarah they're going to have a kid. Now imagine your grandma getting the information she was going to be pregnant again in her 80s. That's crazy, but that's the backdrop that Abram and Sarah have in this story. They know right here their entire life is going to change in their golden years, and they've still got this nephew Lot that they're trying to intervene for. So let's check that out in chapter 18. This chapter actually talks about Abram and his conversation with God. And in verse 20, we learn this about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, where his nephew Lot has settled in. Verse 20 says, "So the Lord told Abraham, I have heard a great outcry from Sodom and Gomorrah, because their sin is so flagrant. I am going down to see if their actions are as wicked as I have heard. If not, I want to know." Now, Abraham, being concerned about the righteous men that live there, or the possibility of that, and of his nephew Lot, begins to intercede for the city. He begins to ask some questions. And in verse 23, he approached God with this: "Will you sweep away both the righteous and the wicked? Suppose you find 50 righteous people living there in the city. Will you still sweep it away and not spare it for their sakes? Surely you wouldn't do such a thing, destroying the righteous along with the wicked. Why would you be treating the righteous and the wicked exactly the same? Surely you wouldn't do that. Should not the judge of all the earth do what is right?" And the Lord replied, "If I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will spare the entire city for their sake." Now, Abram has heard the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah. He's pretty confident there's not 50 righteous people in the city. So what he does is he continues to ask God, what about 45? What about 40? What about 35? And he actually ends in verse 32 with this: "Finally, Abraham said, 'Lord, please don't be angry with me if I speak one more time. Suppose only 10 are found there.' And the Lord replied, 'Then I will not destroy it for the sake of the 10.' And when the Lord had finished his conversation with Abraham, he went on his way, and Abraham returned to his tent." Abraham's biggest concern here is his nephew, Lot. He wants to know, is he going to be spared in this terrible city? Now, here's the thing. The story goes crazy. The city is far worse than you and I probably could even imagine, and Lot is certainly mixed up in some of the city's wickedness. But God delivers and answers Abram's prayers by taking Lot and his family out of the city before administering a punishment. So the story ends in Genesis chapter 19, verse 27, and it says, "Abraham got up early that morning and hurried out to the place where he had stood in the Lord's presence. He looked out across the plain towards Sodom and Gomorrah and watched the columns of smoke rose from the cities like smoke from a furnace." Verse 29, this is so cool. "But God had listened to Abram's request and kept Lot safe, removing him from the disaster that engulfed the cities on the plain." Now here's the thing. Abraham over and over again did the thing that wasn't normal. In fact, when him and Lot were having conflict, they said, let's separate the territory we have so that we both can be satisfied. And again, now that Lot's even mixed up in some wickedness, Abraham goes, I'm still going to continue to pray for him, care for him, and beg God to do something in his life. And guess what happened? God intervened. Lot was saved. Abraham didn't do what was normal because praying for your family isn't normal. So there you have it. That's Abraham's story with his nephew Lot. What we saw there was Abraham prayed on behalf of his nephew, and God intervened and did some pretty cool things with their family. And the same thing can happen with your family. See, here's the deal. Atypical families, families that are not normal, pray and ask God to help them through their circumstances and their disagreements. So when you feel like you have a disagreement coming up or conflict with your parents, here's what I would challenge you to do. Number one, pray and thank God for your family. Number two, pray that God would give you the fruit of the Spirit, the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control that you need to get through the situation. Also ask God for wisdom for you and for whoever in your family is involved. And then lastly, thank God for helping you through this conflict. So what's a disagreement you've had with a family member recently? Maybe a sibling or a parent. Maybe it's something you disagree about all the time, like curfew or bedtime or phone privileges or something else. Now here's what I want to do, is I want to ask you a couple of questions and cause you to think a little bit about it. But what if, when those conflicts came up, instead of immediately going into a fight, you paused to pray? How do you think it would change if you paused to pray about your own attitude, your own perspective, and your own temper. What about this one? How do you think it would change the other person if you were to pray for them? And lastly, what could change in your family if you committed to praying every time you had a conflict? What long-term patterns in your disagreements might go away if you invited God into those things? Here's the deal. This week, what we talked about was this idea that conflict is normal. It's gonna happen. But families approach it differently. Atypical, not normal families, you know what they do? They have a conversation and they invite God into that conversation. What could happen in your family if you continually invited God into conflict? How could God use your family to impact the community and world around you? Let me pray for you, and then I invite you to stick around for worship and part 3 of our Ephesians series. Let me pray. God, thank you so much that you love us. Thanks, God, that you intervene, that you step in when our families have conflict. And God, thank you for allowing us to invite you to do that. God, can you give us the courage to do that? Can you give us the courage to admit when we're wrong and when we need help and when our temper needs to chill out a little bit? And God, can you give us clarity and good conversation around points of conflict? It's in your son's name we pray. Amen. Hey, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next Sunday.